Restomod Daisy with an exciting update. We did a video last week concerning this little gem. This is a trigger one of my subscribers has cobbled together from one of my billet steel trigger assemblies. It featured a roller, and of course it's got these super keen, nifty brass spacers. Well, I've deciphered what the dots were about. The red dot on this side means that the red dot on this side goes in here, and the black dot on that side is referring to the black dot on this side. So that when it's assembled, it looks like thus. And that's how you would get it installed in a gun. Now, the guy that built this trigger has been having issues with a wide body Daisy. He's got a Model 95. I tried to fit this trigger assembly into a Model 99 and did not have any success. I then tried to fit it into a Model 96 and didn't have any success. And the reason for that is because the interior receiver sleeve is going to have to be drilled out to accept the larger diameter of the brass pieces. And since these guns have other destinations as final destinations, we're not going to mod these to see if we can get this trigger to fit them. We're just going to say I couldn't do it without drilling holes in it, and I didn't want to drill holes in those two receivers. But on the plus side, there is a receiver I don't mind drilling holes in at all, and that's the receiver of the mighty 105B Cutaway. So what I did was I grabbed an old Model 36, which is a Rogers, Arkansas gun, but an early design Daisy, which is exactly the same receiver as the 105B. I then utilized the trigger bolt hole position in the 102 to mark and drill yet another hole, this one, in my 105B receiver so that it could take a metal trigger, because I really wanted to see just how well this worked in a working gun environment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to roll over to the bench and we're going to install this trigger assembly in this receiver in this hole. Now, this was originally a plastic trigger gun, so the receiver bolt is in a different position for the plastic trigger, but since we're not using the plastic trigger, we're using the metal trigger, we're going to use a different hole. So that's what those holes are about. And that's why this gun has so many holes in it. It has a hole for a high pivot lever and a low pivot lever. And now it has a hole for a plastic trigger and a metal trigger. It's just a wonderfully versatile gun. Let's go over to the bench and get this rascal installed. Okay, so now to install this metal trigger in this receiver, you have to go in stages because there's three pieces to the trigger assembly itself. The billet trigger with a neat little roller that actually works, the brass sleeve that serves as a spacer from the left side, and another brass sleeve that serves as a spacer from the right side. Now, this particular trigger, which is the only one in existence right now, this is it, there is no more on planet Earth, will work with the older Daisy bolts. They'll slide right through and fit as they should, because the gun this trigger was designed to work in has older bolts. The newer bolts are a little bit bigger and will require a larger hole, but that is an item or an issue for another day. To get this installed, the first thing you need to do is get your trigger placed, and that's a pretty normal process. But instead of fishing the trigger bolt through the receiver to hang the metal trigger, what you have to do is put the trigger in place and push it to one side so the brass part sticks out. Then you grab your secondary piece with a pair of pliers and you position it like that, because what you want to do is reach in there and get that positioned on the trigger assembly on its corresponding mating surface with the brass bolt. Then you take your trigger bolt and you slide it through both pieces until you stick it through the edge and it comes out the back side, as we can see there. So now our trigger is installed, and if you'll note, as advertised, it has no left-right wobble to speak of. It hangs nice and true. Now, let me grab a bolt, or excuse me, a nut, and a nut driver, and we will get this thing installed. All right, so the next phase is to take a nut, stick it on the outside, and thread it onto the trigger bolt, just like you normally would with the Daisy. Now, the amount of squeeze you put on this bolt will determine how stiff this trigger can be. So a lot of squeeze makes for a really stiff trigger. A little squeeze makes for a trigger that's got slop. And if you're in between, you want some kind of squeeze, but you don't want it falling free, but you don't want it fighting with you. There's middle positions that can be obtained. These are all user adjustable, and I think that's kind of cool. So now we've got our trigger installed, and if you note, when I wiggle the trigger, the whole gun wiggles, but the trigger doesn't wobble. And daisy triggers are kind of like weebles. They wobble, but they don't fall off. They usually slop back and forth left and right. So this is kind of cool. So part one of the test is it doesn't wobble. That's great. And it doesn't. Now what we're going to do is install the bits that make it go poot. So we're going to drop our lever in, a high pivot lever in this case, as we can see from where the pivot's at, and it's going to go into the high pivot hole right here, and we'll mount that up, and then we'll put a buttstock on it. And because it's a metal trigger, our buttstock will have to have a trigger return spring, unlike the plastic triggers, which don't require them to function. But that's all part of the confusion about the fact that this is a high pivot receiver that had a plastic trigger that's now been retrofitted with an old school metal trigger without an internal spring like the plastic trigger. So you got to make your trigger spring up with the spur on the back of the hammer, like so. Can you see that? Like so. And then you wiggle the buttstock around until you can get the stock bolt through its mounting hole and secure. And then we get to show you the magic. But first we have to fiddle a bit. I can't see what I'm doing here. There it is. So once you get your stock bolt hole cleared and get your stock bolt through and in position, you just merely tighten that down. Now I want to point out that this is in fact an old Red Ryder buttstock off a number 111 model 40 Red Ryder. And as you see, it fits this 105B receiver. Kind of cool. Now what I'm going to do, because of the miracle of the cutaway, is we're going to reposition the gun slightly, and we're going to watch and see how this trigger assembly, let me get that spun a little bit so a camera person can get to see it. We're going to see how this trigger assembly actually works. Now this is where the real magic, I think, occurs. Let me find my probe. There we are. You'll notice on the nose of this trigger, there's a small roller. And the roller, in fact, rolls. So that is supposed to reduce the amount of friction it takes to release this sear. Watch that little rascal while we cycle the gun. So I also want to point out that the gun's equipped with a sliding spring block, but that's immaterial to the trigger function. So you arm the lever. Now watch, see how the trigger pushes right back up, so smooth and easy, and fully seats. There's no friction grab on the front of the sear, and you'll see that a lot in a regular daisy, where the sear grabs, but this action, where the trigger actually seats at the base of the sear notch, doesn't usually occur. And then with the SSB, we put the gun in battery, and then we pull it. And it's a really smooth let-off. Also, the cocking energy has a nice defined click, click. And then arm the gun and shoot it. And then, hey, let's do it again. Arm the gun, shoot it. It's so cool. I really can't stress how this trigger doesn't feel like any daisy trigger I've ever shot. I mean, it's not like it's got trigger, the trigger doesn't have take up. There's no change in pressure. It's just smooth, but it's very predictable. When it gets to the end of its travel, it goes. I think it is a real winner. And I'm looking forward to putting this on some other guns. But I have to say, it's a handmade item. A lot of labor in this, and I'm afraid that it just might not be feasible or viable. But for a couple of guns, I think it's going to be a reality. Well, that's it. This is the rolling trigger with the little roller at the front. Billet steel, fitted into a 105B receiver with a trigger return spring on an old Red Ryder buttstock. It's a really great compilation of different bits and pieces from different guns, all working to make the same thing happen, which is make the shooting experience enjoyable. I got to do that one more time. I can't wait to get this in a gun that's firing. That's all we got for you today, kids. This is Shane Bruce with Restomod Daisy, signing off.